So I thought it would be cool to revisit the very first Android phone that I ever owned and see if I could still use it in 2017. This was a bad idea. The very first Android phone that I ever owned, and actually the very first smartphone that I ever owned, was the MyTouch 3G Slide. If you don't remember, the MyTouch line of phones was a T-Mobile exclusive, and this version was called the Slide because it had a full slide-out physical QWERTY keyboard, which we really don't see on smartphones anymore, but this was a pretty common form factor back in 2010 when this phone was released. I've been using this phone for several days now as my daily driver, and I'll admit there were some feelings of nostalgia to going back and using my very first Android phone, but those feelings quickly wore off after using it for just a few hours. Before you can start using a phone, you have to pop in your SIM card, obviously, but most if not all phones now use nano SIM cards, but back in 2010, phones were still using full-size SIMs, so in order for me to even be able to use this phone, I had to plug my nano SIM into a micro SIM adapter and then plug that into a full-size SIM adapter. Going back to an Android phone that is 7 years old makes you really appreciate how far Android phones have come, and as you would expect, this phone has definitely shown its age in pretty much every way. As far as the phone's design, it's really thick and chunky because of the keyboard, but the overall footprint of the 3G Slide is really small. You could comfortably reach every inch of the screen with just your thumb, and the entire phone practically fits in the palm of your hand. That's not something you could say about most Android phones anymore. Back when I originally owned this phone, I thoroughly enjoyed using the keyboard, and while I prefer on-screen keyboards now, it didn't take me that long to readjust to using it again. It wasn't the most spacious physical keyboard, but it was still fairly easy to use. The keys are nicely spaced out, there's a good amount of travel to them, and it's also backlit, which made it pretty easy to use in the dark. The phone is entirely made of plastic, which wasn't that big of a deal because back in 2010, plastic phones were a lot more common, but in 2017, it feels pretty cheap compared to phones made of glass or metal. There's really no point in talking about specs because they're all very outdated, but if you must know, it had a blazing fast 600 MHz processor, half a gigabyte of RAM, and a whopping half a gigabyte of internal storage. It also has a micro SD card slot, but it only supports up to a maximum of 16 gigabytes. With only half a gigabyte of storage, I was only able to install a few apps and one game before receiving a warning that my phone was low on memory, so having a micro SD card was basically a must on this phone for it to even be remotely usable. When this phone came out, it was actually considered a mid-range phone, and anything that was a flagship at the time typically had a 1 GHz processor. A 600 MHz processor sounds pretty laughable at this point, but the definition of what is a mid-range phone in 2017 is very different from what it was 7 years ago. The performance on this thing is extremely laggy. It drops frames constantly, apps are slow to load, and you can pretty much forget about playing games on this phone. It's so choppy that it's virtually unplayable. Another part of this phone that has not aged well is the screen. It has a 3.4-inch display that's extremely low resolution, so it's pretty easy to see pixels, and there's a very noticeable air gap between the glass and the actual display itself. It's running a very old version of Android with Android 2.2 Froyo, and before I could even download any apps on it, I had to manually update the Android market to Google Play. It almost wasn't worth the effort, to be honest, because the app selection is very limited and the versions of the apps that you can download are all very old, which isn't all that surprising. This phone also shipped with Htc Sense. It was slightly modified for the MyTouch line of phones, but it was mostly the same experience that you got on other HTC phones at the time, like the Evo 4G or the Thunderbolt. This phone also predated the selfie era, so there was no front-facing camera, and if you wanted to take a selfie, you had to do it the old school way and flip the phone around and use the 5-megapixel rear camera. Compared to current Android phones, the camera on the 3G Slide just doesn't hold up. It's slow and clunky, and the quality is pretty bad, but it did come with a physical shutter button, which is something else we also don't see a lot on Android phones anymore. A couple other things that this phone has that have gone the way of the dinosaurs or are heading that way is a headphone jack, a removable battery, and it even had a trackpad, but because this phone is so old, it lacks more current technologies like wireless charging, fast charging, a fingerprint sensor, or water resistance. The big question I want to answer here is this phone usable in 2017? And the technical answer is yes. It's totally usable as a phone, but because this phone is so outdated, it made it really tough to use as a daily driver. I still had to carry around another Android phone simply because this phone can't do everything I need my phone to do. I could deal with the sluggish performance, I could deal with the lack of functionality due to the much older version of Android, but what it really came down to was the app selection. Most of the apps that I use and depend on nowadays, like Slack for communicating with my colleagues, Philips Hue and LifeX apps for controlling all the smart lights in my home, and many other apps and games just aren't compatible with the 3G slide. It's almost as bad as using a flip phone as a daily driver. You can certainly get by with it, but with my life revolving around staying connected and getting work done on my phone, it's no longer a viable solution. But what is your very first Android phone, and could you still use it in 2017? Let us know down in the comments below. And as always, give this video a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. Subscribe to the channel, which is also down below, and hit that notification bell while you're at it so you don't miss out on future videos. And check us out on social media: Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, Google+, all that good stuff will be linked down below. And as always, check out the website as well, AndroidAuthority.com, because we are your source for all things Android.